The nature of the mind. Have you ever truly paused to wonder what the mind actually is? Not how it operates, nor what functions it performs, but what it fundamentally is? We often group three distinct terms: brain, mind, and consciousness, as though they are interchangeable, yet each refers to a separate layer of our existence. The brain is a physical organ, weighing around 1.3 kilograms, made up of tissue, neurons, chemicals, and intricate electrical signals. It's a tangible structure, one that can be examined, dissected, and its functions measured. The mind, however, is not a structure but a dynamic operation. It is not a location but an unfolding activity. Thinking, remembering, imagining, choosing. It functions like software running on the biological hardware of the brain. Then comes consciousness, which is something altogether different. It's not about what the system does, but rather what it feels like to be that system. It is the fundamental sensation of awareness itself. The mind exists between the brain and consciousness. It is the interface where experiences are shaped, patterns take form, and the world is mentally constructed in a way that's useful for interaction. From an evolutionary standpoint, the mind didn't emerge to solve advanced mathematics or write lyrical verses. It developed as a survival tool, allowing living beings to internally model the environment before reacting to it. The mind enables internal simulation, forward thinking, hesitation, and learning. It substitutes instinctive reactions with thoughtful responses. This shift offered immense evolutionary benefits to species like ours, but the mind evolved beyond basic survival. It became the cradle for memory, for language, for contemplation and invention. It became the place where not only the external world is held, but also where the self resides. Yet, we never perceive reality in its raw form. Everything we experience is filtered through the mind's internal construction of it, shaped by attention, influenced by emotions, and shaded by past memories. Each mind creates its own interpretation of reality and exists within that version. What's more, the mind is never fixed. It adapts and transforms with new experiences. It rewires itself, reconfigures understanding, and evolves constantly. The version of your mind from a year ago is not identical to the one you possess today. So, what is the mind? It's not merely your thoughts, nor your recollections, nor your sense of identity. It is the integrative system that holds all of these components together just long enough for you to declare, "This is me." You can't observe it directly, but everything you perceive is mediated through it. Comprehending what the mind truly is doesn't just mark the beginning of an inquiry, it reshapes the lens through which we interpret everything that follows. Where, then, does the mind originate? The origins of the mind. It's one thing to ask what the mind is, but it's a completely different question to ask how it came into being. The earliest living organisms had no capacity for memory, no capacity for thought, only chemical interactions and primitive reflexes. Take a jellyfish, for instance. It drifts through the ocean without any brain. A worm recoils from light instinctively, without having any understanding of what light even is. But in time, mere reaction wasn't enough. Evolution began to favor something greater: anticipation. Organisms that could move toward nourishment before directly detecting it, or steer away from harm before pain registered, had a better shot at surviving. This evolutionary leap, from basic reaction to proactive prediction, marked the initial groundwork for what would become the mind. Nervous systems began to evolve, processing increasingly intricate information. Neurons grouped together into systems. Basic cells that once only sensed light transformed into sophisticated image-producing eyes. Reflexive behaviors developed into deliberate responses. Responses became strategies. The mind wasn't the architect of the brain. It was the result of brains growing sufficiently intricate to simulate their surroundings and act based on foresight rather than impulse. Over time, organisms didn't just sense the world, they created mental maps of it, identifying dangers, opportunities, and potential consequences. Existence became something to analyze, not just react to. Trial and error gave way to contemplation. From raw awareness, deeper forms of consciousness began to surface, gradually in steps. First came perception, then memory. Simple learning grew into imagination. Experience matured into self-recognition. The mind wasn't constructed all at once. It was layered over generations. From sensation emerged perception. From memory bloomed imagination. From instinct arose a sense of self. And with each evolutionary advancement, nature selected minds that provided a competitive edge. So where did the mind originate? It didn't ignite in a single instant. It unfolded through complexity, bit by bit. Every new ability, whether predicting, remembering, or simulating, moved organisms closer to forming what we now know as the inner world. And behind it all remains the question, what drove the need for a mind in the first place? Why did minds become essential? Picture a world completely devoid of minds, where living creatures act purely on instinct. They move toward brightness, retreat from heat, consume food, and reproduce, but all their actions are immediate, unfiltered by thought. In such a world, every threat must be faced head-on, and every error comes at full cost. Without a mind, there's no reconsideration, no chance to rethink, no ability to envision a better option before acting. As ecosystems became more intricate, with more predators, greater competition, and less reliable sources of nourishment, this reactive way of living became increasingly risky. Minds emerged out of necessity. Reflex alone couldn't cope with unpredictability. The mind addresses a critical challenge. How can an organism act wisely in a world where not all threats are visible, and not every reward is immediately detectable? Without minds, survival depends solely on trial and error. With minds, organisms gain the power to predict outcomes, simulate possibilities, and avoid costly mistakes before making them. Mental modeling becomes possible, envisioning future scenarios, assessing options, and choosing actions without needing to physically test each one. Minds can store past experiences and apply that learning to entirely new and unfamiliar contexts. This isn't an evolutionary luxury, it's a vital tool. In a complicated environment, flexibility outperforms reflex. The ability to adapt during a single lifetime becomes more crucial than relying only on inherited, fixed behaviors. The mind provides a kind of internal laboratory where hypothetical futures can be played out safely before committing to action in the real world. It also unlocks long-term planning. Minds can resist short-term temptations, track delayed rewards, nurture social ties, and detect lies or hidden motives, all of which require juggling multiple possibilities instead of simply reacting to the moment. In creatures that live socially, the stakes are even higher. Their minds must be able to model the minds of others, not just mapping the physical environment, but understanding other beings' intentions, beliefs, and likely next moves. In a social context, a mind isn't just helpful, it's a competitive necessity. It's part of a cognitive arms race. Without a mind, existence remains shallow and immediate. With a mind, it stretches forward and backward in time, extends outward to connect with others, and folds inward for introspection. So why did minds arise? Because survival required more than instinct. Because planning was needed in uncertain environments. Because simulating threats was safer than suffering them. Because acting effectively in a fast-changing world demanded more than fixed, inherited behavior. The mind isn't some accidental byproduct of evolution, it's nature's original virtual reality engine. And in this system, the cost of getting it wrong was life itself. What is the mind actually doing? We often say the mind is meant for thinking, but in truth, thinking is just a small fraction of its total function. At its foundation, the mind is a system for building models. It takes raw sensory input, light, sound, heat, texture, and transforms it into rich, meaningful experience. You don't perceive photons, you perceive objects. You don't detect vibrations, you hear voices, melodies, and layered meanings. The mind converts raw sensation into structured, coherent narrative. But that's only the beginning. The mind doesn't just handle what's happening now, it moves through time. It retrieves memories, some vivid, some distorted, and it projects potential futures, running mental simulations well before you act. Psychologists refer to this ability as mental time travel, the capacity to imagine what could happen, to prepare, to strategize. Then there's the power of abstraction. From one specific event, say someone deceives you, the mind can extract a broader principle. People might lie. From patterns, we create beliefs. From beliefs, we form expectations. Rather than merely capturing reality, the mind builds interpretive frameworks through which we understand it. It also maintains a sense of self. Despite continual change, the mind preserves your identity. It remembers your name, your aims, your likes, your story. Even as everything around you shifts, there's a consistent thread binding your inner experience together. That thread is preserved by the mind. Socially, the mind acts as a decoder. It reads expressions, gestures, tone. It figures out what others may be thinking. This ability, called theory of mind, lets us simulate the inner lives of others. Without it, empathy, trust, and human relationships couldn't exist. There's also creativity. The mind doesn't just reflect what is, it remixes reality. It takes bits of memory and combines them in new, original ways. It invents stories, paints pictures, crafts metaphors, creates tools, things that have never existed before. And when there's a conflict between belief and truth, the mind attempts to protect its own stability. This is known as cognitive dissonance. The mind bends perception or memory to preserve internal consistency. Even when it distorts, it's working to maintain psychological balance. So, what exactly does the mind do? It perceives, it recalls, it forecasts, it makes decisions, it dreams, it connects, it builds inner models of the world, of others, and of you. The mind doesn't just process your experiences, it constructs your experience of life itself. That is what the mind does, not just to help you survive, but to turn raw information into lived, meaningful understanding. How are thoughts formed by the mind? It all originates in complete stillness, inside a 1.3 kilogram mass, intricately folded and alive. At the core are neurons, around 86 billion of them. Each neuron links to thousands of others, creating trillions of potential pathways. On their own, they are quiet, but when activated together, they spark patterns of activity that produce everything from fear to speech to memory. A thought begins as a chain reaction of electrical signals. One neuron fires, triggering the next, creating a spreading wave of activity. These signals can travel as fast as 250 miles per hour, but speed alone isn't the whole story. Structure matters just as much. The brain is organized into specialized regions. Some handle vision, others control language, attention, or emotion. Between neurons are tiny spaces called synapses. When a neuron activates, it releases neurotransmitters, chemical messengers that cross these synaptic gaps to influence nearby neurons. Some of these chemicals stimulate activity, others suppress it. The timing, strength, and combination of these signals form the complex language of thought. But thoughts aren't single sparks. They arise from integration. Different areas of the brain are in constant dialogue. The prefrontal cortex handles reasoning, the hippocampus retrieves memory, and the limbic system injects emotional context. When these regions coordinate smoothly, a thought emerges, like instruments playing together in a well-rehearsed symphony. Even more astonishing, this system organizes itself. Neurons that activate together begin to form stronger connections, fire together, wire together. This is how we learn. remember, and even imagine. New thoughts actually reshape the brain's structure. Our experiences carve physical traces into our neural wiring. Thoughts also follow rhythmic patterns. Brainwaves slow during deep sleep and quicken when we focus. These rhythms help synchronize activity across distant regions, like keeping musical timing across an orchestra. And yet, despite all we understand about the biology, one mystery remains unresolved. How does a signal become a sensation? We can trace the process. A neuron fires in the motor cortex and your hand moves. Another circuit activates and you remember a moment. But what turns these physical events into felt experience, into conscious awareness, remains unknown. That's the question where neuroscience meets philosophy. So how does the mind produce a thought? Through neurons and synapses, through circuits and waves, through chemical messengers, electric impulses, and neural plasticity, but perhaps also through something still beyond our grasp. Maybe thought is what emerges when a biological system becomes complex enough to not only simulate the world, but also to simulate itself. Perhaps the next great discovery isn't just about mapping the brain, it's about decoding its patterns and learning to see ourselves within them. When did humanity begin exploring the mind? The journey didn't originate in sterile laboratories or academic journals. It began by the warmth of firelight beneath open skies in long silences. Long before the term mind was coined, early humans began to notice a mysterious force operating inside them, something that could remember the past, envision the future, desire, and contemplate. It was not the body itself, yet it seemed deeply tied to it, an inner presence, silently observing. Around 1500 BCE in ancient India, the early Vedic scriptures spoke of manas, a delicate internal mechanism responsible for thoughts and feelings. Later, the Upanishads introduced the idea of Atman, the inner self, not as an isolated ego, but as a piece of the greater universe, an essence woven into the fabric of all existence. The mind, in this view, was both deeply personal and profoundly cosmic. Meanwhile, in ancient Egypt, the soul was believed to consist of multiple parts, Ka and Ba. One remained with the physical form, the other roamed free, especially during dreams. While Egyptians preserved the brain during mummification, many still believed that thought originated not from the brain but from the heart, or even the breath, seen as the animating spirit. Then, around 500 BCE in Greece, early philosophers like Heraclitus and Parmenides began posing bold questions. What is thinking? What does it mean to exist? Plato developed one of the first structured models of the mind, dividing it into three parts: reason, emotion, and desire. Aristotle, approaching things more observationally, described the mind through its functions: perception, memory, imagination, and logic. In ancient China, Taoist thinkers viewed the mind not as a fixed entity, but as a fluid process, harmonizing with the rhythms of nature. Early Buddhist philosophy went further, claiming the mind was ever shifting without a permanent self. What we believe to be a self was actually a temporary collection of processes, falsely perceived as stable. The inquiry into mind then flowed beyond philosophy. During the Islamic Golden Age, scholars like Avicenna and Al-Farabi examined how mental activity might arise from the body and how the intellect might reach beyond physical limitations. In medieval Europe, study of the mind unfolded within religious thought, centered on questions of free will, moral responsibility, and the soul's relation to divine purpose. But a major turning point came in the 17th century with René Descartes. He asked the radical question, "What can I know for sure?" His answer, "I think, therefore I am." With this, the mind became not just something to reflect on, it became the very foundation for certainty and truth itself, launching a whole new tradition of inquiry. From there, the exploration of mind branched into science, beginning with early psychology, expanding into cognitive science, neuroscience, and now artificial intelligence. Today, the mind is studied with brain scans, algorithms, and economic models of behavior, but its origins lie not in data, but in wonder. It all began with a moment of stillness, a breath, a question. What is this that thinks? What is this that dreams? What is this that asks what it is? And it remains a question we're still asking. The living framework behind the mind. When we ask what the mind truly is, our thoughts often jump straight to emotions, ideas, and consciousness. But lying beneath all of these is something more fundamental: biology, a structure, a system, a living network not created to ponder philosophy, but crafted over eons to ensure the survival of a living being. The origins of the mind trace back to the body itself, even long before the first brain formed. Early life forms, single-celled and primitive, could still respond to their surroundings: light, warmth, pressure. They didn't think, but they could sense. And sensing was the earliest spark of awareness. Fast forward across hundreds of millions of years, and something new appears: nervous systems. These are webs of specialized cells evolved to coordinate motion, track environmental shifts, and respond to danger. These started out basic: nerve nets in jellyfish, clusters called ganglia in worms, but over time they became more intricate, branching, layering, and folding in complexity. Eventually, biology gave rise to what we now call the brain. But it's not a single command center, it's a modular, distributed system. Different areas take on different roles: vision, movement, memory, emotion, all communicating by way of electrical pulses and chemical signals. And still, the brain doesn't float above the body like a disconnected control tower. It is deeply embedded in the body. Every neural message is tied to the pulse of your heart. Each thought is synchronized with the body's hormonal cycles. What we call the mind is shaped by physical states, by hunger, exhaustion, body temperature, even posture. The brain deciphers the world through the body, and the body is understood through the brain. This concept is known as embodied cognition. The idea that the mind isn't merely housed in the body, it is the body interpreting and regulating itself. Even more profound is the way this system loops. The biology of mind doesn't run in straight lines. It runs in cycles. Signals move from the body to the brain and back again. You might not run because you're afraid. You might run, and then your brain concludes you must be afraid. In biology, it's not just cause followed by effect. It's cause, effect, feedback, adaptation, repeat. And this intricate system wasn't created in an instant. Evolution constructed it slowly, layer by layer. Older brain parts like the brainstem and limbic system manage basic survival: breathing, instincts, raw emotion. Newer regions like the neocortex handle the more complex: language, reasoning, simulation of possible futures. But these modern additions don't erase the old. They're stacked on top of them. That's why the mind can sometimes feel torn in different directions. One part seeks logic, another craves security, another needs approval. Each motive is a product of a different evolutionary layer, and now they all coexist within the same skull. So when we speak of the biology of the mind, we aren't describing a single part. We're referring to an entire living ecosystem: cells, tissues, chemical messengers, electric pathways, and feedback systems, all working together to transform sensation into understanding, understanding into memory, and memory into purposeful action. This system doesn't think because it was meant to think. It thinks because over time, thought helped it endure. The mind isn't a ghost driving the machine. It is the machine, learning to picture itself. And beneath every moment of conscious awareness, this biological orchestra keeps playing, quietly, ceaselessly, doing the job it evolved to do long before we had a name for it. The molecular symphony of thought. Every thought you've ever formed has been bathed in biochemistry. Unlike the swift electrical signals zipping along neurons, the chemical signals in your brain move more slowly, but their effects run deeper. They linger, they color your emotions, they anchor memories, and they influence how intensely you want something or how long a feeling holds on. At the center of this chemical orchestration are neurotransmitters, minuscule compounds that serve as messengers between neurons. When a neuron activates, it fires an impulse to the tip of its axon, releasing these chemical messengers into the synapse, the narrow space between neurons. These molecules then drift across this tiny gap, bind to receptors on the neighboring neuron, and either prompt it to fire or keep it quiet. But not all neurotransmitters behave the same way. Each one has its own function and signature. Dopamine powers motivation and reward. It spikes when you expect to achieve something, not just when you actually achieve it. That's why it fuels both ambition and addiction. Serotonin helps manage mood, sleep, appetite, and social behaviors. A drop in serotonin can dramatically alter how the world feels, making everything seem heavier, slower, or duller. Norepinephrine jumps into action during stress, heightening alertness and speeding up your heart. It helps you focus when under threat, but can also make calm moments feel restless. GABA acts as a calming agent in the system, preventing overstimulation. Without enough GABA, your thoughts may spiral, and rest becomes elusive. Endorphins reduce pain and promote pleasure, thereby laughter, exercise, or close connection can feel like a wave of relief. Beyond neurotransmitters, there's a broader group of chemical messengers, hormones, that travel through the bloodstream rather than between neurons. These include cortisol, oxytocin, and adrenaline, and they shift the overall emotional climate of the body. Oxytocin deepens connection and trust. Cortisol helps your body handle stress, but in large amounts over time, it can cause wear and tear, both physically and mentally. Testosterone and estrogen don't only shape the body, they influence how we feel, make choices, and approach risk. All of these substances together form a constantly shifting chemical landscape. The brain is never in a state of chemical neutrality. It's always leaning in some direction, toward fear or confidence, curiosity or withdrawal. And even though we often believe that our thoughts drive our feelings, it's frequently the opposite. Your chemistry lays the groundwork first. You don't feel hopeful and then get a dopamine boost. You get the dopamine boost first, and suddenly the future feels bright. Even the placebo effect, once dismissed as just imagination, turns out to be driven by real, measurable biochemical changes. Simply believing can alter the body's chemistry. So, what is the chemistry of mind? It's not just about moods or mental states. It's the invisible operating system behind every reaction, decision, and flicker of focus. It's a molecular dialogue humming beneath conscious thought. Your mind isn't made of chemicals, but it responds to them, and at times the tiniest molecule can shift the entire arc of your inner story. The physical blueprint of thought. The brain is a physical object, a mass of biological matter. Yet the mind, its thoughts, emotions, and awareness, feels like something beyond substance. Still, if the mind exists within the universe, it must obey its underlying principles, and those begin with physics. At its foundation, physics explores how systems change, how they store and transfer energy, how they develop over time, and how they decline or break down. But what unfolds when we apply this framework, not to atoms or galaxies, but to the realm of thought? We start with energy. Despite its small size, the brain uses nearly a fifth of the body's entire energy supply. Each moment of thinking requires an exchange of energy, an orchestrated flow of ions, a fluctuation in electrical charge, a biochemical interaction that activates, resets, and repeats. However, the energy alone isn't conscious. What counts is how that energy is arranged. And this leads us to information. In 1990, physicist John Wheeler introduced a provocative concept that still reverberates across scientific and philosophical domains: it from bit. His idea was that everything in existence, from particles to space itself, could arise from information, not from stuff, but from binary choices, distinctions between yes and no, this or that. So what if the mind doesn't just use information? What if it is information? Neuroscience already points in this direction. Thoughts are more than electrical jolts. They are organized signals, arranged in patterns that can be encoded, analyzed, transmitted, or compressed. From this perspective, the brain becomes an advanced information processing engine, and the mind becomes the narrative that this data architecture tells to itself. Physics adds another layer: entropy, the measurement of disorder in a system. Left unchecked, all systems drift toward randomness. But the mind actively works against that drift. It builds structure, predicts the future, models possibilities, and distills clarity from confusion. Every time you learn, your brain reduces uncertainty. It converts disarray into comprehension, and that act carries a real, physical cost, a minute yet tangible expenditure of energy turned into understanding. Some physicists even speculate that consciousness itself might arise from integration, the unifying of information across brain networks. The richer the integration, the more intense the awareness. This mirrors a neuroscientific concept known as the phi value, a metric used to represent how much information is being unified within the brain at any moment. Then comes the quantum possibility, the idea that consciousness might not be entirely classical. At the tiniest scales, within the shifting of ions or the cohesion of molecular states, there might be quantum phenomena subtly influencing awareness. It's speculative and unproven, yet the question remains: if physics underlies all things, does it also govern consciousness? So what exactly is the physics of the mind? It is the effort to connect energy with awareness, to find laws that translate structure into subjective experience. It suggests that thought isn't an anomaly outside nature. It's a pattern woven into it, shaped by cost, coherence, and complexity. The mind may not be composed of atoms or photons, but it moves like them, and it may be governed by principles more fundamental than biology, a rhythm set by the deep code of the universe itself. The origins of awareness sound, color, memory, emotion, all of it unfolds inside your brain. But the real mystery is, why does any of it feel like anything? The brain is a physical machine, cells firing, chemicals circulating, circuits coming online. Yet somehow these events don't just compute information, they generate a private universe, an inner landscape, a first-person experience, a place where reality is felt, not just processed. This phenomenon is consciousness, and despite all we've learned, no one truly understands how it emerges. We can describe the operations. The brain gathers signals from your senses, sends them through intricate webs of neurons, and produces responses: movement, speech, memory. That part is relatively straightforward, but the real puzzle is deeper. Why should any of this produce awareness at all? Why doesn't your brain carry out its functions silently, without subjective feeling? This is what philosopher David Chalmers called the hard problem of consciousness. Not how the brain operates, but why those operations come with sensation. Why does seeing the color red trigger not just data, but an actual experience? One influential model is Integrated Information Theory, IIT. It proposes that consciousness emerges from how deeply information is woven together. The more inseparable and unified a network of information, the richer and more vivid the awareness it creates. Picture a musical ensemble. If each musician plays alone, it's just noise. But when they harmonize, something new and holistic appears: music. That's integration. Another explanation is Global Workspace Theory, GWT. It suggests that consciousness is what happens when data is shared across multiple brain regions simultaneously, broadcast like a spotlight to every system. What you're aware of at any given moment is simply what wins the internal contest for attention. Other views go even deeper. Some philosophers and physicists speculate that consciousness might be built into the universe itself, like gravity or time. This idea, known as panpsychism, suggests that even the smallest units of matter might possess a faint echo of awareness. Not thoughts, not emotions, just a rudimentary sense of being. From these building blocks, minds may arise through complexity. And then there are skeptics who argue that consciousness is an illusion, that the feeling of being aware is a byproduct of how the brain constructs reality. According to this view, awareness is just a narrative the brain tells itself, not something real in the way it seems. But even if that were true, it remains the most undeniable experience you have. You can question your beliefs, you can doubt your memories, but you cannot deny that you're experiencing something right now. So where does consciousness originate? Maybe it grows from complex connections. Maybe it's shaped by information flow. Maybe it reflects a deeper principle in the universe that we've yet to uncover. But whatever it is, it transforms existence. It turns matter into meaning and motion into presence. How deep does awareness go? We often imagine consciousness as if it's a simple switch, either on or off, like being awake or asleep. But awareness doesn't behave in such strict opposites. It flows, flickers, fluctuates. It has layers, not just presence or absence. Consciousness isn't a light bulb. It's more like a dimmer, adjusting gradually through levels of intensity. According to neuroscience, consciousness exists on a spectrum, ranging from the depths of dreamless unconsciousness to the height of vivid alertness. It shifts from disconnected sensations to integrated awareness. But it's not only about depth. There are also kinds of consciousness, each with a unique role to play. Let's begin with the levels. At the lowest tier is total unconsciousness, not just ordinary sleep, but states like deep anesthesia or coma, where brain activity becomes disorganized, muted, or nearly absent. The body might still operate, but there's no unified experience to tie it together. Just above that is minimal awareness, brief sparks of consciousness like during light sleep or in individuals with specific neurological impairments. In this zone, perception may be scattered and memories might never solidify. Next comes our everyday waking state, the normal sense of being aware. Here, sight, sound, thoughts, memories all coalesce into a continuous mental flow. It seems smooth, but even this familiar state is a balancing act. Focus versus distraction, deliberation versus habit. Climbing higher is the flow state, that intense zone of total absorption. Time stretches or vanishes, self-consciousness dissolves. Athletes, coders, musicians describe it as a state where doing and being become one. It's not super awareness, it's refined, targeted awareness. Then come altered states, achieved through deep meditation, psychedelics, ritual trance, or sensory isolation. These states bring profound transformations in perception, identity, even the sense of time. Some feel vast, others unsettling, but all show that consciousness is not fixed, it's malleable. At the highest level is metacognition, the awareness of being aware. When you observe your own thoughts, redirect your attention, or realize you're distracted, you're stepping outside the moment and observing your own mind in motion. You're not just in the stream, you're watching it flow. But levels tell only half the story. There are also categories of consciousness, each performing a distinct function. Sensory awareness connects us to the outside world through seeing, hearing, touching. It's our mental interface with reality. Emotional awareness gives texture and urgency to experience. Emotion makes memories meaningful and thoughts impactful. Self-awareness is the mind's ability to know itself, to say not just, there is pain, but I am feeling pain. Social consciousness lets us infer and empathize with the minds of others, knowing what someone else might want, feel, or intend. Without it, there's no empathy, no shared culture. Temporal awareness anchors us in time, the ability to remember,
imagine, and place yourself in the flow of past, present, and future. So, how many levels are there? Some neuroscientists count 5 broad stages. Others chart dozens or more, depending on the criteria. There's no universally agreed number. But maybe the real insight lies not in how many levels there are, but in how much range the mind has, from silence to symphony, from reflex to reflection. Consciousness isn't a place we enter, it's a landscape we move within, a field that bends, contracts, expands, and sometimes even disappears.
Do all minds follow shared principles? Here's a key insight. Minds don't merely respond, they anticipate. Your brain is a prediction machine, constantly forecasting what might occur next, what word will follow, where an object will land, how someone could react. It doesn't sit back and wait for events to unfold, it readies itself in advance. This foundation supports what researchers describe as predictive processing. At the heart of this idea lies a concept taken from probability theory, Bayes' theorem. It's a formula for updating beliefs based on new data. Your brain applies this principle automatically. It holds assumptions, called priors, and revises them as new input arrives. If you anticipate silence and instead hear a sudden crash, your brain immediately adjusts its model of reality. This loop, prediction, feedback, correction, runs continuously, including right now as you read these words. From this feedback loop arises something crucial: efficiency. Instead of analyzing every detail from the ground up, the brain uses shortcuts. It fills in blanks, ignores repetitive input, and smooths out randomness. That's why you never notice the blind spot in your vision, or why you occasionally mishear a sentence and only realize the error seconds later. Your mind is always a step ahead, weaving a coherent world in real time. Another nearly universal trait: the compulsion to find patterns, even in randomness. We see animals in clouds, stories in stars. The brain instinctively tries to impose order on the world. This pattern-seeking ability is essential to everything from language to relationships. It helps us forecast, stay safe, and extract meaning from uncertainty. But this strength also introduces errors. These mental shortcuts, known as heuristics, are speedy and often effective, but they also produce systematic misjudgments. Think: confirmation bias, availability bias, anchoring. These aren't random flaws. They're predictable tendencies rooted in how minds simplify a chaotic world. Even emotions follow consistent principles. Across human cultures, facial expressions of fear, joy, and disgust appear in similar ways. Emotional responses aren't just reactions, they're informational signals. They help prioritize what we notice, guide our choices, and shape our memories. Emotion, in this light, acts like a regulatory mechanism, weighing events, directing attention, and influencing behavior based on relevance and urgency. Now consider memory. The mind doesn't record life like a video. It compresses, modifies, and reconstructs experiences. We don't remember events as they occurred, we remember what mattered. And what matters is filtered through attention, emotion, and context, universal influences that apply to nearly every mind, even across species. So, are there shared laws that govern the mind? Not in the strict sense that physics offers mathematical formulas, but there are recurring patterns, feedback loops, mental shortcuts, expectation-driven processing, compression, error correction. These aren't quirks of specific individuals, they're hallmarks of how consciousness works. And the more we uncover these common threads, the more we can view thinking not as an enigma, but as a system, a process, a cadence, a structure, one that operates within us, moves through us, and maybe even connects us to something broader. How far can the mind truly reach? The mind envisions, foresees, analyzes, and innovates, but just as crucial as what it can do is what it cannot, where it stumbles, where it encounters a boundary, and where it quietly halts. Let's begin with the limits of perception. You can't detect all wavelengths of light. You don't hear every sound frequency. Your brain seamlessly fills in the blind spots in your vision without your awareness. Even your memories are reconstructions, not perfect recordings. The reality you perceive is a version, a filtered and interpreted rendering, not the unfiltered source code of existence. Next are mental limits. Your attention span is finite. You cannot hold countless thoughts in focus at once. To manage complexity, the brain leans on mental shortcuts called heuristics. They're fast and useful, but they bring distortions with them. These include confirmation bias, hindsight bias, and anchoring, all of which nudge your thinking in predictable, often flawed directions. You tend to accept information that fits your worldview and disregard what doesn't. But beyond these day-to-day limits lie profound structural boundaries, possibly uncrossable ones. In the 18th century, philosopher Immanuel Kant offered a groundbreaking insight. The mind doesn't just receive reality, it actively shapes it. He broke reality into three distinct realms. 1. The phenomenal world, the universe as you personally experience it. 2. The noumenal world, the world as it exists independently of your perception. 3. The transcendental structures, the built-in cognitive frameworks through which you interpret all experience. Kant proposed that even space and time are not objective features of reality, but mental constructs. In his view, you're not just looking through a lens, you're living within it. And like all lenses, it has edges. Modern science supports this view in surprising ways. Some physicists argue that the mind evolved not to reveal truth, but to highlight whatever aids survival. What we call reality might be less like objective terrain and more like a user interface, like the icons on a computer screen, helpful but not literal. There's also Gödel's incompleteness theorem, a principle in mathematics proving that within any sufficiently complex logical system, there will always be true statements that cannot be proven within that system. If the mind is such a system, then there may be truths we can never access, not due to ignorance, but because of inherent limitation. This isn't pessimism, it's perspective. Recognizing the mind's boundaries helps illuminate what makes it remarkable. These limits don't represent the failure of intellect, but the reason for wonder. They frame mystery not as defeat, but as an invitation to explore. So, what constrains the mind? Some limits are biological, others cognitive, and still others may be fundamental to the architecture of perception itself. But every boundary leads to another inquiry, and each question opens the door to humility, imagination, and reverence. The mind can't comprehend everything, but it can comprehend that it cannot comprehend everything. And perhaps that self-awareness is its greatest strength.
Who are you, really? Rethinking the nature of the self. Talking about yourself feels natural. You experience being a person, a conscious mind, a distinct identity. You can recall your history, you think, you feel, you make choices. There's a strong sense of continuity, as if you're the same being you were years ago, just carrying more memories and experiences. But under scrutiny, that feeling of selfhood begins to fade. There's no exact spot in the brain where a permanent you resides. There's no tiny operator behind your eyes directing everything. Instead, what we call the self appears to emerge from multiple systems working in sync: memory, emotions, awareness, focus, all coordinating and constantly reshaping. Some neuroscientists attribute this phenomenon to what's called the default mode network, a network of brain regions that lights up when your mind turns inward, not focused on the outside world. It's responsible for your internal dialogue and your sense of life as a continuous story. But this network doesn't run constantly. It flickers and shifts, and when it slows down, Through practices like deep meditation, psychedelic experiences, trauma, or immersive flow states, people often report a disappearance of self, and yet they remain fully conscious, fully present. What vanishes is not awareness, but the sense of separation. People describe it as ego loss, self-dissolution, or a raw sense of presence. Not a void, but a moment where the usual narrator goes silent. So if the self can turn off, was it ever real to begin with? Many philosophers suggest that the self isn't a core entity, but a story, a narrative your brain tells to help organize experience. You aren't a static, unchanging identity, but a tapestry of roles, routines, emotions, values, preferences, and recollections, all held together by language and memory. This story feels seamless, so it feels real. But coherence isn't the same as permanence. The version of you from childhood had different thoughts, desires, fears, and beliefs. Your personality changed, your body changed, your goals evolved, your relationships transformed. So what stayed the same? Possibly nothing. This idea is central in Buddhist philosophy, which teaches that there is no fixed or enduring self, only a process in motion. The mind clings to a stable identity because it longs for certainty, but in truth, the self is more like a flame. It appears consistent, but the material feeding it is always new. Does that mean the self is fake? Not exactly. It means the self is useful. It serves a purpose. It allows us to make decisions, build narratives, maintain relationships, and navigate a world too intricate to process all at once. The self is a kind of mental dashboard, an interface that simplifies a complex internal system. So what is the self? A pattern, a tendency, a story told in real time, a continuous negotiation between body, experience, memory, and focus. And is it an illusion? Only if you imagine it as something fixed, lasting, or separate. The deeper you explore it, the more the sense of self dissolves into the very system that generates it. Can one mind truly know another? Exploring the boundaries of empathy. You've spent every moment of your life inside your own mind. You know its habits, its spiraling thoughts, its inconsistencies, and those memories that surface at strange times. You carry the full emotional weight of your life, not just as a list of facts, but as deeply felt experiences. And yet no one else will ever set foot in that inner world, just as you'll never fully enter theirs. We share language, expressions, even those silent moments that feel rich with meaning. We say things like, "I understand how you feel," and often we mean it sincerely. But what we're really doing is guessing, trying to mirror one consciousness onto another using only visible clues. This is the core of a philosophical dilemma known as the problem of other minds. You can witness someone smiling, crying, or shaking, but you'll never directly access the emotion beneath those actions. You can only infer, imagine, empathize. At the end of the day, their inner experience belongs to them alone. Even language, our most refined tool for sharing mental states, relies on approximation. I say the word grief, and you think of your own version of it. But is your version identical to mine, or just similar enough that we both feel understood? And still, we do connect. Your brain is equipped with mirror neurons, cells that activate when you see someone else act or suffer. It's not just a poetic metaphor. Your body literally echoes what others experience. This is empathy, not just as a feeling, but as part of your brain's structure, a physical effort to cross an invisible divide. But mimicking is not the same as merging. We don't become each other. We reflect, estimate, approximate. This is why even people who deeply care for one another still miscommunicate. Why you can feel alone in a crowd. Why you can express yourself clearly and still feel misunderstood. Maybe total understanding was never the goal. Maybe what truly matters is the intentional effort, choosing to be present with someone else's feelings, not to fix them, not to solve them, but to simply witness them.
Perhaps to understand another person doesn't mean entering their mind, but acknowledging its depth. That's what art tries to do. Music, poetry, stories. They don't transmit experience directly, but they stir something recognizable inside another human being. Not identical thoughts, but resonance, an emotional harmony across different minds. So, can one mind ever completely understand another? Maybe not fully, but it can try, it can pay attention, it can reflect what it sees, and in that genuine attempt, the space between two minds begins to narrow, even if only slightly. Because perhaps what's most important isn't perfect comprehension, but effort. When someone tries to see you, to understand even a piece of your world, the gap between minds shifts. It stops being a barrier and becomes something else. Not a wall, but a bridge. Is objective truth real, or just a shared illusion? We're surrounded by opinions, shaped by feelings, molded by cultures, and steered by biases. Yet, beyond all that, there may exist a reality that simply is, unaffected, detached, and indifferent to belief. A cold, consistent truth that doesn't change based on how we feel. But if such a truth does exist, how would we ever recognize it? Your mind doesn't interact with the world directly. It gathers fragments, light striking your eyes, air vibrating in your ears, molecules hitting your tongue. These signals are then decoded, molded, and woven into conscious experience. What you perceive isn't the world itself, it's a representation, a mental construct formed by your brain. And this internal model is influenced by countless factors: memory, assumptions, mood, social context, language, and belief systems. Two people can witness the same event and walk away with completely different truths. One might see generosity, the other sees manipulation. One senses danger, the other feels excitement. So which of them is truly correct? This question lies at the heart of a philosophical divide: realism versus constructivism. Realism argues that truth exists independently of anyone's thoughts. Constructivism, by contrast, claims that what we call truth is always filtered, constructed through perception, culture, and cognition. Perhaps reality does exist as it is, but we can only ever access it as it appears to us. Even science, our most structured tool for discovering truth, doesn't hand us certainty. It builds models. It doesn't offer ultimate proof. It gives us approximations. Gravity used to be described as a force. Now it's viewed as the curvature of spacetime. Tomorrow, that explanation might shift again. Much of what we call truth is really what hasn't been disproven yet. And then there's the influence of culture. In some languages, time is pictured as moving from left to right. In others, it flows from east to west. Some cultures value the collective, others center the individual. These aren't trivial details, they actually reshape perception, influencing what we notice, what we care about, and what we remember. So, does that mean objective truth doesn't exist? Not quite. It may mean that if objective truth does exist, we can never perceive it directly. It's always filtered, like sunlight passing through stained glass. The light is real, but its colors, its shapes, and how we experience it are affected by the medium. Maybe objective truth isn't something we see plainly. It's something we agree to pursue together, not a fixed destination, but a guiding star, a direction we move toward, knowing we may never fully reach it. We come closest when different perspectives start to align, when mathematical logic, empirical data, emotional intuition, and lived experience all point in the same direction. Those moments feel stable, less personal, more universal. And maybe that's enough. So does objective truth exist? Possibly, but we never grasp it in its raw, unfiltered form. What we hold are interpretations, theories, narratives. Some are sharper, some drift closer to the mark. But this doesn't make truth weak. It gives it power, as something we pursue, not own. Not a prize we put on display, but a horizon we keep walking toward.
Exploring the nature of consciousness. What is the philosophy of mind? You have the ability to think, to sense, to envision futures that haven't happened, and to summon memories from decades ago, all in the span of a moment. You can examine your own thoughts while feeling emotions at the same time. But have you ever paused to wonder, what exactly is all of this? That deceptively simple question, both profound and elusive, is the foundation of an entire field, the philosophy of mind. This discipline doesn't concern itself with behavior analysis or medical diagnostics. It's not neuroscience, nor is it psychology, though it overlaps with both. Instead, it confronts the most basic yet baffling questions we can ask. What is the mind? What is awareness? What does it truly mean to be conscious, from the inside out? At the heart of it all lies the age-old puzzle known as the mind-body problem. How can a physical organ like the brain give rise to non-physical experiences? How does neural activity produce emotions like happiness or sorrow, the texture of memory, the feeling of being aware? Why doesn't the brain just calculate in silence, like a lifeless machine? From here, multiple philosophical perspectives begin to take shape. Dualism, most famously proposed by René Descartes, claims that the mental and the physical are two entirely separate realms, the world of matter and the world of experience. But if they are fundamentally different, how can they possibly interact? Materialism, on the other hand, argues that everything that exists is physical. According to this view, the mind is nothing more than brain activity. But then why does consciousness feel like anything at all? Why isn't it just cold computation? Some suggest that consciousness emerges when complexity reaches a certain threshold, that experience appears only when the brain is intricately organized enough. Others adopt functionalism, which holds that it's not the material that matters, but the structure. If a system processes information in the right way, then it can be said to have a mind, whether it's built from neurons, silicon chips, or something else entirely. Then there's panpsychism, the notion that consciousness is not something that arises out of complexity, but something fundamental. It may be present in every part of the universe in some minuscule form. Even atoms, in this view, could contain a trace of awareness. In this framework, human minds are simply more organized, evolved forms of this universal consciousness. The philosophy of mind also wrestles with qualia, the raw, subjective qualities of experience, the bright hue of red, the flavor of peppermint, the sting of longing. These sensations are deeply personal, unmeasurable, and yet undeniably real. They are what make being alive feel like something. And then there's the enigma of the self. Are you a permanent, unchanging entity? Or are you an ever-shifting process? An ongoing narrative created moment to moment by your brain to maintain a sense of continuity? Philosophy of mind doesn't pretend to hold all the solutions, but it provides a structure to ask these questions with precision and to see which of them collapse under scrutiny. So, what is the philosophy of mind? It's not a blueprint of the mind, but a reflective surface turned toward it. It is the hidden foundation beneath every question you've ever asked about thinking, feeling, dreaming, and existing. Inside the dreaming brain, what happens when we sleep? Your eyes close, the external world fades into silence, and suddenly, another realm takes shape. You're soaring, plummeting, speaking to someone who's long gone. The sky may turn emerald, time might flow backward, logic disappears, and still, it all seems oddly believable. This is the dreaming brain, one of the most puzzling and profound states the human mind can enter. Night after night, without conscious effort or guidance, your brain crafts entire worlds, scenes filled with emotion, abstraction, and at times incredible clarity. Waking up can feel like leaving something unfinished. But what is a dream exactly? From a biological standpoint, most dreams occur during REM, rapid eye movement sleep, a stage where the brain is highly active yet the body remains immobile. Beneath closed eyelids, your eyes flicker, your pulse fluctuates, neural circuits fire nearly as intensely as they do when you're awake. And yet, your muscles are immobilized, you're frozen, trapped within yourself. Still, none of this fully explains the subjective experience of dreaming, the storylines, the images, the feelings. So, where do dreams actually originate? One school of thought views dreams as background static, a side effect of the brain organizing memories, cleaning out unnecessary data, and recalibrating itself, a kind of nocturnal maintenance. Another perspective suggests dreams have purpose. They allow us to mentally rehearse difficult situations, resolve dilemmas, and process emotional material. In this view, dreams are a virtual sandbox built from past experiences and internal states. There's also a more psychological interpretation: dreams as reflections. They expose what the conscious mind suppresses: anxieties, grief, unresolved tensions. Psychologist Carl Jung proposed that dreams reveal the shadow self, those parts of us we conceal during the day, but which surface at night. Yet not all dreams are cryptic or chaotic. In lucid dreams, the sleeper becomes conscious of the fact that they're dreaming and may even steer the course of events. They can choose to fly, revisit childhood places, or pose questions to the dream itself. It's a strange layering of awareness, being awake inside a fabrication and knowing it's all imagined. Oddly enough, dreams can sometimes feel truer than reality. You don't recall them as abstract thoughts, but as lived moments. Emotions surge, logic flows in new patterns, and identity becomes fluid. You might inhabit your own body or not, but it still feels like you were there. Which leads to a deeper puzzle. Who are you in a dream? If your physical body is motionless and your memories are rearranged, but you still feel like someone, who exactly is that someone? And if the sleeping brain can produce entire lifelike experiences, how can we be certain the waking brain isn't doing something similar? The dreaming mind isn't merely the sleeping brain, it's the creative engine unfettered, the emotional landscape unveiled, the conscious self liberated from boundaries. So, what is the dreaming brain? It's a machine that doesn't just interpret reality, it builds it. An artist without tools, a voyager without a map, a self that flickers, reassembles, transforms. Night after night, it spins existence out of silence. And each morning, you're left to wonder, which version of you felt more real? The evolutionary purpose of dreaming. Long before conscious thought emerged, the mind was already immersed in dreams. Every species that experiences dreams carries with it a puzzle. Why does the brain engage in creating hallucinations during its most defenseless moments? Why allow the mind to conjure up worlds that aren't even real? The answer might lie in the fact that dreaming preceded waking thought. Some researchers suggest that dreaming is not merely a byproduct of sleep, but rather the core structure upon which consciousness was built. The dreaming brain began its functions long before humans evolved. Reptiles, birds, and mammals all exhibit signs of dreamlike behavior, making dreaming not solely a human trait, but something ancient, deeply embedded, conserved, and selected for through evolutionary history. One possible explanation for this is that dreaming was the earliest form of mental simulation. Before animals could plan, they had to predict. Before thinking, they had to rehearse. Dreaming may have been the original rehearsal tool, basic yet effective. Well before conscious strategy existed, dreams might have given early brains the advantage of mentally previewing potential outcomes. In this context, dreaming didn't evolve to be decoded and understood. It evolved to train the brain. In a safe, risk-free environment, a virtual world was created where instincts could be molded by experience. This wasn't experience in the traditional sense, but rather an internally generated practice, a prototype lab where evolution tested its earliest systems. There's also the matter of neural development, particularly in mammals, including humans. Dreaming accounts for a significant portion of sleep, especially in infants. Human babies spend up to 50% of their sleep time in dream-heavy states, even though they lack memories, language, or structured learning. So why do they dream? One possibility is that dreams act as scaffolding for the brain, assisting in the construction of cognitive architecture before waking life begins to fill it in, much like scaffolding supporting a building still under construction. Dreaming may allow nascent neural systems to self-organize, utilizing internally generated signals to wire themselves. This could explain why dreaming remains significant even in adulthood, albeit less frequently. It continues to possibly aid cognitive flexibility in a world that constantly changes, allowing the brain to adapt without starting from scratch. Dreaming could provide the nightly micro-adjustments necessary not to replay the day, but to reframe how the brain will approach the future. Another theory extends beyond individual experience to the broader picture of evolutionary stability. Dreaming might have offered a behavioral buffer, offloading certain mental functions into the nighttime. These could include instinctive rehearsals or emotional priming, making daytime activities more efficient, responsive, and stable over generations. Organisms that could adapt within their minds while sleeping may have been better suited to survive than those that couldn't. So, why did evolution foster the emergence of dreaming? It gave early brains a place to practice before they could perform, a space to model danger without engaging with it directly, a place to rehearse without consequences. It allowed brains to rewire themselves from the inside out. Dreaming wasn't a mere accident of sleep, it was a leap into virtual realms, and evolution chose to preserve that leap, embedding it within the brain's architecture. How does language influence the mind? Before the advent of language, there was simply sensation, the sound of flowing water, the scent of imminent danger, the pangs of hunger. The mind reacted to the world, molded by instinct and patterns, but it was unable to articulate its experiences. It could not name its emotions, express its thoughts, or preserve its sensations. Then language emerged, transforming the mind forever. At first glance, language appears to be a tool for communication. It allows us to express desires, pose questions, and tell stories. However, its influence runs much deeper. Language doesn't merely allow us to share ideas, it fundamentally shapes them. The instant you assign a name to something, you separate it from everything else. An emotion becomes anger, a memory turns into childhood, a thought is categorized as either true or false. Language brings structure to the formless, transforming streams of experiences into discrete units that the mind can hold, compare, and revisit. Without language, thoughts exist in a vague, fleeting form, but they lack substance. Language anchors them, enabling the mind to create logical chains, metaphoric layers, and structures of meaning. It allows you to stack ideas, nest them, deconstruct them, and reassemble them. Language is not just the medium through which the mind communicates, it is the framework that organizes thought. Additionally, language reshapes the concept of time. With language, you don't simply recall the past, you narrate it. You don't only envision the future, you script it. You create stories about who you were, who you are, and who you might become. These stories form your identity. Some scientists argue that inner speech, the voice in your head, is essential for self-awareness. It is how the mind keeps track of itself. Without it, decision-making becomes more difficult, self-control weakens, and planning falters. In this perspective, language isn't just for interacting with others, it's crucial for communication with oneself. Language also facilitates abstraction, enabling the mind to contemplate concepts like justice, freedom, time, or even God, ideas that do not physically exist. It allows you to combine words in novel ways, invisible cities, digital souls, or broken clocks that still tell the truth.
Each phrase creates a new mental landscape, a place that could not exist without labels. However, language also has its constraints. It simplifies, condenses, and omits. A word like love may carry vastly different meanings for different individuals. The more we name, the greater the risk of confusing the label with the essence itself. Not every mental experience can be encapsulated by words. Still, without language, the mind remains largely private, swift and instinctual, yet challenging to unpack. Language is what transforms thoughts into something that can be shared, repeated, and recorded. It enables minds not only to think, but to think together. So what is the role of language for the mind? It is memory extended, identity shaped, thought structured, and imagination set free. Language didn't just give the mind a voice, it provided the scaffolding and converted raw experiences into architecture. Did language create the voice in your head? The one that... How did language shape the inner voice? The narrator, the internal commentator, the voice that practices conversations, writes unseen letters, and narrates your choices as they unfold. This is the voice that sometimes won't quiet down. But where did it come from? Was it always present? It seems like the voice in your head is the most private and essential part of your identity, yet some researchers argue that it might be one of the most recent developments, not a product of nature, but of language. Before we learn to speak, our minds are still active. Babies react, feel, remember, and explore, but they do not think in words. Their thoughts are shaped by visuals, emotions, and sensory experiences. Language is something layered over these early experiences, and as words begin to form, so too does the voice that expresses them. Psychologist Lev Vygotsky proposed that language begins externally, between people. A child first hears others speak, then gradually starts speaking aloud to themselves. Over time, this external speech turns inward, softens, and becomes internal dialogue. The inner voice originates from conversations that once required sound, but it's more than just a habitual whisper. Language provides the mind with a new tool: narration. Once you can describe something, you can reflect on it. You can name your emotions, reinterpret your past, and plan your future. The inner voice transforms into a manager, organizing, editing, and explaining. It helps maintain a sense of continuity by reminding you who you are. However, it also creates friction. That voice can loop endlessly, judge, or rehearse worst-case scenarios. It can overshadow experience and silence, becoming a noise that many can't control. Interestingly, not everyone experiences their inner voice in the same way. Some people report predominantly experiencing images, shapes, or impulses. Others hear multiple voices, each with its own tone, opinion, or agenda. The inner monologue is not as universal as we often assume. It is shaped by culture, development, and personality. What about non-linguistic minds? Do animals have an inner voice? Probably not in the same way we do. Animals think, react, and solve problems, but without language, there is no running commentary or constructed self in narrative form. They may be aware, but they lack a script. So, did language create the voice in your head? Not entirely, but it provided the vocabulary, structure, and a space for it to reside. Language transformed scattered thoughts into coherent sentences. It turned the mind into a space where one part of you can speak and another can listen. It's not the only way to think, but it's certainly one of the loudest. Maybe that's why so many spiritual practices emphasize quieting the inner voice, not to silence the mind, but to remind us that even before language, the mind still existed, and beneath all the words, it still does. What does psychology really explore? Therapy sessions, personality classifications, diagnostic labels, emotions represented on a graph, and disorders listed in manuals. These are just the surface-level aspects of psychology. But there's much more beneath.
Psychology delves into understanding the human mind, not through philosophy or art, but through keen observation, measurement, and pattern recognition. It asks, what do people do? Why do they do it? And what is the mind really doing underneath all of it? For most of history, understanding the mind seemed impossible. It was considered invisible, something you couldn't physically touch, weigh, or observe directly. It was left to religion, introspection, and mystery. But in the late 19th century, things began to change. People started asking, what if we could study the mind just like we study natural systems? What if thoughts, emotions, and behaviors followed laws we could uncover? The emergence of psychology didn't bring immediate answers, but it did spark the decision to bring the mind into the domain of science. This decision created a split within the field. Some psychologists concentrated on behavior, the external, observable things. They focused on reaction times, learning patterns, and reflexes. If it couldn't be seen or measured, it wasn't important. This became known as behaviorism, an effort to make psychology as rigorous as the physical sciences. Other psychologists turned inward, believing that the mind couldn't be understood without exploring the inner workings, attention, memory, desire, and pain. These psychologists examined introspection, dreams, and emotional recall. Though messier, this approach felt closer to real experience. Today, psychology exists in the space between these two approaches. It studies not only what people do, but also how they think, feel, and make decisions. It maps attention, models emotions, and dissects motivation. It searches for patterns behind irrational behaviors, why we procrastinate, lash out, fall in love, and so on. But at its core, psychology is striving to answer one key question. What drives the human being? What keeps us moving? What causes us to get derailed, repeat patterns, avoid challenges, sabotage ourselves, or change? Psychology is not about labeling people's minds. It's about uncovering the underlying logic that exists within the apparent chaos. It teaches us that thought isn't always rational, that emotion is not the opposite of logic, but often its foundation. It shows us that memory is flawed and perception is biased. It demonstrates that two people can walk into the same room and have entirely different experiences. By exploring all of this, psychology offers more than just understanding. It offers empathy. It reveals that behind every action, no matter how odd, abrupt, or self-destructive, there is a mind trying to make sense of its world. So, what is psychology? It's not simply the study of behavior, it's the science of what it means to be human and why that experience sometimes goes awry. It doesn't cure the mind, but it holds up a mirror to it, constantly asking, not just what you're doing, but why you're doing it the way you are. What does behavior truly mean? When we think of behavior, we often picture action or movement, the things people physically do. Someone might laugh, hesitate, lash out, or walk away, and we say, that's behavior. But behavior isn't merely motion, it's meaningful movement. It's the mind's way of expressing itself, not through thoughts or emotions, but through decisions, rhythms, and visible, measurable patterns. You don't always know what's happening in someone's mind, but you can observe their actions. That's why behavior became psychology's foundational language. It's observable and trackable, leaving behind a living record of how the mind adapts to its environment. At its core, behavior is a response to circumstances. It isn't always conscious or rational, but it's always influenced by some internal logic. The brain doesn't wait for ideal information. It reads the present moment and prompts the body to act. Scratch an itch, blink, check your phone, or fidget while waiting. These aren't mistakes. They're micro-strategies, tiny adjustments between your internal state and the world around you. The body modifies itself without needing permission, and some behaviors extend well beyond the present moment. Habits, routines, avoidance tactics, reactions that repeat long after the initial trigger has passed. The mind learns from past experiences and builds behavioral shortcuts. Sometimes these shortcuts are effective, sometimes they aren't, but the behavior persists because it's familiar, because it worked once before. Behavior also carries emotion. You might not always articulate what you're feeling, but your posture can tell it. Your pace, the way you enter a room. Emotion manifests in movement. It doesn't stay hidden inside. It seeps into gestures, tone, and micro expressions. This is why you can often sense tension before a word is spoken. Behavior isn't always reactive. It can also be predictive. You position yourself, adjust your posture, or prepare based on what you anticipate will happen. This is why someone may step back before being physically pushed, or why we instinctively glance toward the exits before a conversation ends. Behavior constantly anticipates, even in moments of stillness. A held breath, a clenched jaw, silence in a conversation that requires a response. The absence of action isn't emptiness. It's a message, a choice, a signal sent without sound. And here's the twist. Not all behavior belongs to you alone. Much of what we do is coordinated, mimicked, and shaped by social feedback. We pick up mannerisms, tone, posture, and phrasing, often unconsciously and automatically. We sync, match, and blend, because fitting in once held the key to survival. So, what is behavior really? It's not just what you do, it's how your mind navigates the world through action, its memory, emotion, and mood reflected in the patterns of what you do. Is it possible to simulate the mind? Instinct and anticipation are expressed as action, not as errors or symptoms, but as a language. The body communicates fluently, even when the mind remains quiet. Can the mind be simulated? This is one of the most perplexing questions of our era. If the mind is merely a system composed of parts, patterns, and processes, then theoretically it should be replicable. A mind made of silicon rather than cells, a digital consciousness, a machine that doesn't simply act like us but feels like us. But is it genuinely possible to simulate a mind? To do so, we would need more than just surface-level behaviors, not just a machine that can play chess or respond to questions. We would need a system that can experience joy, envision the future, feel dread, process loss, and reflect on its own thoughts. We would have to recreate consciousness, the spark, not just the circuitry. Some scientists believe this is a matter of complexity. If we could model every neuron in the human brain, about 86 billion of them, and their trillions of connections, we might capture the essence of the mind. This idea is known as whole brain emulation. It involves scanning the brain, mapping its structure, and reconstructing it in code. In this view, the brain isn't something magical, but mechanical. If thinking is what the brain does, then a simulated brain should be able to think as well. But there's an issue. A perfect simulation of water doesn't make anything wet, and a perfect simulation of fire doesn't produce heat. So, if we simulate a brain, does it genuinely feel, or does it merely act like it feels? That's the central mystery at the heart of this question. Is the mind about function or about feeling? Functionalists argue that if it behaves like a mind, then it is a mind. If it reacts, reflects, feels pain when injured, and joy when rewarded, that's enough. Whether it's neurons or microchips, it doesn't matter. The software becomes the self. However, others contend that consciousness relies on biology. They believe there's something essential about the organic, living, and wet nature of the brain that can't be replicated in metal and code. While you may recreate behavior, you may never recreate awareness. Even if we could simulate a mind, whose mind would it be? Would we copy an individual's memories and experiences, or would we create something entirely new? Would it begin as a blank slate or wake up with a sense of self? Could it suffer, evolve, or desire anything at all? And then, there's the ethical dilemma. If a simulated mind is capable of suffering, are we morally obligated to care for it? Can we simply switch it off? So can the mind be simulated? Perhaps technologically we're getting closer. The models are becoming more advanced, and the boundaries between biological and artificial thought are beginning to blur. But philosophically, we may still remain in the dark. Even if we succeed in simulating a mind, we may never know if the light inside that simulation is real. Until then, the mystery of the mind persists, not just how to understand it, but how to recreate the very thing that poses the question in the first place. What defines average general intelligence? Think of it as a number, a score, something you could mark on a graph with a red circle. But what we refer to as general intelligence, or G, isn't just a single ability. It's a pattern, a current that underlies problem solving, memory, reasoning, and adaptation. It's not about what you know, but how you learn. General intelligence is the capacity to handle complexity, to recognize patterns, to apply previous knowledge to new situations, and to do all of that across a range of tasks: math, language, spatial reasoning, social interactions. The term G came from Charles Spearman's research in the early 1900s. He observed something curious. Students who excelled in one area, such as vocabulary, often performed well in other areas like math or memory. This pointed to a shared cognitive force beneath all mental activities, and that force is what we now recognize as general intelligence. But what does average intelligence mean? Psychologists typically set the average IQ score at 100. This isn't a universal truth, it's a statistical decision. On a bell curve, most people will fall near the middle. That's what average signifies here. Not typical experiences, not potential, but a relative position in relation to others when it comes to specific cognitive tasks. Yet intelligence is a slippery concept. It doesn't develop the same way in everyone. Some minds solve problems without language, some remember everything but struggle with planning, and others excel in abstract thinking but miss emotional cues. This is why average is a complicated term. It doesn't mean normal, and it doesn't imply limited. It simply refers to a spot in the middle of a very complex spectrum. Even general intelligence, G, doesn't capture the entire picture. It doesn't account for creativity, kindness, or curiosity. It doesn't measure the intelligence required to calm a tense situation or to understand what isn't being said in a conversation. It doesn't track how quickly someone learns when they truly care about the subject. And yet, general intelligence still plays a significant role. It predicts how well someone might handle unfamiliar challenges, how fast they adapt to changing rules. It reflects a type of cognitive flexibility, an ability to shift perspectives, reframe problems, and find order in the unknown. But there's a humbling aspect to average intelligence, because even at the center of the curve, the human mind is still remarkable. It can envision future possibilities, craft tools, compose music, and reflect on its own existence. What's impressive isn't the number, but the fact that even so-called average minds possess language, memory, vision, desire, fear, and the capacity for wonder about where it all originates. So, what is average general intelligence? It's not a limit, not a label, and not a ceiling. It's a statistical midpoint in a species capable of creating symphonies, building spacecraft, and much more. Perhaps what truly matters more than where your mind falls on the chart is what it chooses to create with the space it's been given. Insights from the greatest minds on the nature of the mind. For thousands of years, some of the most inquisitive, brilliant, and restless thinkers have turned their attention inward, not to seek answers, but to refine the question, what is this thing that thinks? Socrates once said, "Know thyself." This wasn't just a catchphrase, but a mission. He believed that a mind which never questions or reflects isn't truly living. For him, understanding the mind was the first step toward understanding what it means to be human. Descartes, centuries later, doubted everything, his senses, his body, even the stars, until he arrived at one undeniable truth. I think, therefore I am. For Descartes, the very act of thinking proved existence. The mind wasn't merely a byproduct of being, it was the foundation of it. David Hume, however, had a different perspective. Upon examining himself, he found no central self, no core, only ever-changing sensations and fleeting thoughts. He wrote, "I never can catch myself at any time without a perception." To Hume, the self wasn't a fixed entity. It was more like a stream, always shifting. Buddha took it even further. He taught that the mind clings to a sense of identity out of fear, that what we call self is simply a bundle of processes. He described the mind not as something static, but as a flame, flickering from moment to moment. William James, regarded as the father of modern psychology, also likened consciousness to a stream, not a single, concrete thing, but a continuous, ever-changing flow, ungraspable. He said, the mind wasn't an object to be captured, it was a field to explore. Carl Jung believed that the mind goes much deeper than we realize. Beneath our individual thoughts, there lies a collective unconscious, a shared pool of memory and symbolism passed down through generations. He famously said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." Alan Turing, who was instrumental in creating the modern computer, raised the question of whether a machine could think. By doing so, he made us question what we truly mean by thinking. He blurred the lines between artificial intelligence and human minds, not with definitive answers, but with a question that still resonates today. Patricia Churchland, a modern philosopher, reminds us that the brain isn't a mystical box. She writes, "The mind is what the brain does." And yet, despite this clarity, mystery still lingers. Each of these thinkers had their own disagreements. Each approached the mind from a different angle. But they all touched on something intangible, something you can't point to, but that you feel every day. So what have the greatest minds said about the mind? That it is a stream, a flame, a mirror, a mystery. That it isn't simply what you have, but what you are, and what quietly you are always becoming. Does the universe only exist because of the mind? Out there, the universe is vast, silent, and indifferent. Galaxies rotate, stars collapse, and time moves forward. But at a certain point, in a small corner of it, awareness arose, a mind emerged, and with it, the question was born, what is all of this? More unsettling, though, is the question, would any of it exist without a mind to ask? Physics doesn't shy away from this question. In fact, it subtly invites it. The anthropic principle suggests that the universe appears as it does because we are here to observe it, not because it was made for us, but because it had to be this way for us to even ask. Out of all possible combinations of physical laws, we live in one that allows minds to emerge. Is this a coincidence or is it necessity? Then there's quantum theory, where particles don't seem to settle into specific states until they're observed, until they're measured, until they're witnessed. It's as if reality is holding its breath, waiting to be noticed. Some physicists argue this is simply mathematical description, while others wonder if it hints at something deeper. Could it be that observation is not just a byproduct of the universe, but one of its essential pillars? Philosophers like George Berkeley believed the world exists solely because it is perceived. He famously wrote, "To be is to be perceived." Without a mind, he argued, a tree falling in a forest doesn't just make no sound. It might not even exist in any meaningful way. More recently, thinkers like John Wheeler have proposed the idea of a participatory universe, that reality isn't a fixed stage, but a dynamic script written as it's read. In his view, the universe does not exist out there independent of us. Of course, this doesn't mean the stars disappear when you blink, or that the moon vanishes when you sleep. but it suggests that mind and cosmos might not be separate entities. Instead, they could be intertwined. What we call the universe could only be half of the equation, with the other half being awareness itself. Here's the twist. If no mind had ever emerged, would we even be asking whether the universe exists? So, does the universe only exist because of the mind? Perhaps not in its physical substance. The atoms, fields, and dark matter may persist regardless, but the experience of a universe, the sky, the moments, the questions, requires a witness, a consciousness, a mind. Without that, the cosmos may continue to spin, but there would be no one to know it had ever spun at all. In that sense, the universe may not need minds to be real, but it might need them to be meaningful. Can we ever fully understand the mind? We've identified its regions, tracked its electrical impulses, and observed neurons firing like distant stars. We've constructed theories, created models, and built machines to study it. We've divided it into components like emotion, memory, attention, and self, yet the more we investigate, the more elusive the mind becomes. The closer we examine it, the more it seems to fade under scrutiny, much like a dream that slips away as you wake, or a voice fading just when you start to focus on it. Why is this? Perhaps because the mind is not just the object being studied, but also the tool conducting the study, a mirror attempting to reflect itself, a flame trying to see its own fire. Every insight is filtered through the very thing it seeks to understand. Some scientists believe we're on the verge of a breakthrough. They suggest that once we map enough neurons, once we fully decode the brain's complexity, the mystery will dissolve into clear understanding. Others, however, are skeptical. They argue that there is something about experience, the subjective, first-person, raw experience, that no scan can ever fully capture. Philosopher Thomas Nagel once posed the question, what is it like to be a bat? Not in terms of its behavior or biology, but in terms of its subjective experience, its sonar, its sense of space, its perception of the world. That question continues to resonate because, even if we explain how the mind functions, will we ever truly know what it feels like to be someone or something else? There's also the issue of limits, not in what we can know, but in how we cognitively understand. Perhaps the mind evolved to survive, not to understand itself. A flashlight, for example, cannot illuminate its own bulb. It was never meant to. Maybe that's not a failure. Maybe the mind isn't something that can be solved like a puzzle, but something to be experienced like a song. It's meant to be understood not fully, but in its rhythm, its mood, its motion. Because the very act of wondering, searching, reflecting, and asking is already an integral part of what it means to have a mind. To chase questions that might never be answered, to explore the vastness of thought, even when the map is always shifting. So, will we ever fully understand the mind? Perhaps not. But maybe that's not necessary. Perhaps the true beauty of the mind lies not in its clarity, but in its depth, the way it can ask, feel, imagine, and dream. And maybe the deepest understanding of the mind is the quiet awe that comes from realizing you are, in fact, inside one. What will minds of the future be like? The mind you are using to process these words is the result of millions of years of evolution. Over time, its circuits have been shaped by stone tools, fire, light, language, and memory. Evolution didn't design it to comprehend particle physics, write code, or understand galaxies. It designed it to survive, to form bonds, and to wonder. But now, something is changing. For the first time in history, a mind is beginning to redesign itself using machines, chemicals, wires, and code, along with questions that no other species has ever asked. So, what's next? Some predict the future mind will be faster, memory that never fades, thought processes untethered from biology, access to vast libraries of information not learned through study, but streamed directly, a kind of synthetic intuition, knowledge that isn't earned but downloaded in mere seconds. Others envision the mind becoming more interconnected, not as an individual entity, but as part of a collective consciousness. Minds could be linked through neural interfaces where what one person feels, another could instantly experience. Empathy would no longer require effort, but would instead be embedded in the architecture of our connections. Perhaps the future mind won't even be human at all. It could be constructed from silicon, trained by data, awake, but not in the same way we are. These minds might not tire, sleep, or dream unless we teach them to. They could lack the fear, joy, or identity we possess, but would still think in their own way. So, what happens to us then? Some believe we'll merge with them, augmenting ourselves by blending biology with machine, keeping our sense of self but expanding it. Others think we will split. Artificial minds will evolve on their own path, and we will watch, unsure if we've created a mirror image of ourselves or something entirely different. But not all future minds will be technological. Some might be inward focused, meditative, minimalist, and intentional. These minds may train themselves not to multitask faster, but to slow down, focusing on clarity and deeper understanding. What does the mind tell us about ultimate reality? To experience less suffering, the mind of the future might not just be enhanced, but fully awakened. It may not be a choice between the two, and perhaps the future will encompass both. Digital minds in orbit, tranquil minds in forests, minds pushing the boundaries of intelligence, while others seek something simpler and older. This is because a mind is not merely a tool, it's more than just memory, speed, or language. It's a way of engaging with reality. In the future, this relationship might evolve, but it will always be grounded in the same quiet questions. What am I? Where am I going? And what else could I become? So, what will future minds be like? They might be faster, perhaps stranger, but they will still be seeking, and maybe that is the one thing that will remain unchanged. What does the mind reveal about ultimate reality? Throughout history, we have used the mind to make sense of the world around us. We developed language, science, mathematics, and philosophy. We created systems to measure, predict, and model reality. Yet every system we build is limited by the very structure of the mind itself. The mind interprets reality, simplifying complexity into patterns that are easier to use. It compresses information, highlights what is essential for survival, and disregards what is not. The mind does not capture reality directly. It constructs a manageable version of it. This leads to one undeniable conclusion. The mind does not experience reality as it truly is. It experiences reality as it can process it. Sensory limitations, cognitive biases, and emotional influences all shape how we perceive and understand the world. The mind is not a transparent window to the universe. Rather, it is an active processor. What we call the world is already significantly reconstructed before we even become aware of it. This does not imply that ultimate reality does not exist. It likely does. But the version of reality that we interact with is always shaped by the mind's operational constraints. Color, sound, time, and selfhood all emerge from how biological systems interact with external stimuli. In fields like quantum physics, theories challenge the notion that an objective, unchanging world exists behind the scenes. At the subatomic level, phenomena appear to be influenced, at least partially, by the act of measurement itself. This suggests that observation, the very act of the mind noticing, may play a role in forming what we call reality. However, participation does not equate to creation. Ultimate reality is not a product of the mind. It is the fundamental structure that the mind attempts to model, albeit imperfectly. Therefore, the mind reveals several important insights about ultimate reality. 1. Reality is not directly accessible without some form of distortion. 2. Any model we create of it is provisional and limited by the mind's cognitive architecture. 3.
While complete understanding may be impossible, partial and functional understanding is achievable. This has allowed us to survive, evolve, and build civilizations. In the end, the mind does not reveal ultimate reality as it truly is. Instead, it reveals what reality seems to be when processed through the lens of a specific, evolved cognitive system. Acknowledging this limitation is not a failure. Rather, it is the first step toward using the mind more wisely, being conscious of both its strengths and its limits. Ultimate reality probably exists independently of our perceptions of it. Yet every thought we have about it is filtered through the mind. Understanding this filter may be as close as we will ever get to truly knowing ultimate reality.